Okay. Thank you everyone for attending. I really appreciate it. And like Peter said, we're going to be talking about finger amputation as a cultural custom. And for most of us, the idea that finger amputation is cultural is unheard of. Finger amputation happens because of an accident or is some kind of surgery. We have an issue with a finger, and so we have to have it amputated. And this disbelief around finger amputation as a cultural custom is something that I've experienced throughout the few years that I've been investigating finger amputation. And we can see this with this one comment made by a colleague. In 2018, one of our papers went to a news article, was written about it. And they asked one of our colleagues for a comment. And they said that nobody would be idiotic enough to remove every finger bar the thumb. That simply makes no sense. And so they're talking about a modification to the hand where you amputate portions of all of the 4 fingers and you only leave the thumb fully intact. But despite what we may originally think, these types of practices do exist. They are out there. And an example of this can be found amongst the Dugam Dani from Indonesia, where they amputate a segment of their finger every time a family member dies. So we have instances of more elderly individuals, such as the woman in the picture here, who's obviously lost many people close to her, and therefore is an example of this type of modification that we originally may have thought was completely unreal. And there has been some research on the cross-cultural prevalence of finger amputation, but predominantly this was done in the 1930s by 3 main studies. The first was by Lagerkrantz in 1935, and he looked at finger amputation in Africa, and he categorized whether they were done for ritual purposes or for punitive purposes, as a punishment. From there, we had 2 follow-up studies by 2 different scholars investigating finger amputation in different regions of the world. So first we had Soderstrom in 1938, who investigated finger amputation from Oceania, so from Australia, from Papua New Guinea, and from the South Pacific Islands. And then from there, the third we had by MacLeod, who investigated sacrificial rituals more generally amongst Indigenous North American populations, of which finger amputation was one of the sacrificial rituals that they practiced. And then there wasn't a whole lot of research on the cross-cultural prevalence of finger amputation until 2018, when we published our first piece of research on this, where we did a global survey of finger amputation practices and identified 121 societies, mainly from the ethnographic record, that engaged in finger amputation. So the work that I'm going to present now is really a follow-up to this. We wanted to re-examine the known scope of finger amputation practices. And also, I believe that not only are the behaviors of people important, but also their beliefs. So we wanted to investigate beliefs about finger amputation as well. And so to expand this scope, we wanted to include new types of data. We wanted to delve more into the historical record as well as the ethnographic record. We wanted to investigate folk tales that might feature finger amputation, and also then look to some material evidence, see if we can see finger amputation in the archaeological record, and if there are any ethnographic objects that might be associated with finger amputation. So we'll be splitting this talk into 2 main parts. The first is going to be on behaviors, where we're going to go over the evidence for finger amputation practices amongst ethnohistoric groups, and also investigate the presence of finger amputation in the archaeological record. From there, we'll move on to the beliefs about finger amputation. We'll talk about folk tales that feature finger amputation and some of the themes that are present in them. And then also we'll come back to these ethnohistoric groups that practice finger amputation, and we'll discuss why these individuals engaged in this practice. And so to conduct our survey, we used a number of different databases, online sources, and we managed to find literature from a number of different languages that we can see in the bottom here. So we're going to start off with the behaviors portion. So in our updated survey, we were able to identify 181 culture groups that engaged in finger amputation. So 60 more from our previous study in 2018. And these societies live on all inhabited continents. And the range of dates for these finger amputation practices is over 2,800 years of recorded instances of finger amputation. And the earliest record from this survey was from between 883 to 859 BCE. And these were from the texts of Ashurnasirpal II, who was the king of Assyria in this time period. And in these texts, it listed finger amputation as a possible method of torture. And then we have the latest records from this survey, which were from 2003. And we'll see throughout this presentation that finger amputation is still an ongoing custom, even past 2003, but using our methods for this survey, our latest records were from 2003. And we had two records from this year. One, it was used as a punishment for theft in Iran. And also there was an account from American veterans that said that they used finger amputation to identify fallen comrades from a mass grave context. So they were able to take their fingers and either use fingerprinting or DNA to identify them. And we found that these 181 ethnohistoric cultural groups weren't constrained to a specific type of society. There was a lot of variability in how people got their food, whether they were farmers or hunter-gatherers, how mobile these groups were, if they were moving around the landscape very frequently, or if they were settled in large-scale villages or cities. And also in their level of social stratification. We saw that there were groups that were, highly egalitarian and also ones that were extremely stratified. So it seemed to be that it wasn't just one specific type of culture that was engaging in finger amputation in the past. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the participants, how the practices were carried out. And for all of these, we're going to see that there is ND underneath all of them. And this stands for no data. So in a number of these records, they're quite old, they're quite short, and so we don't have all of the information that we might want. And so we see the number of accounts where we just don't have the data that we might be looking for. But we did find that amongst the groups with available data, that it was occurring amongst both men and women. In some societies, it was only women, and in other societies, it was only men. However, there was also societies in which both men and women engaged in the practice. Also, in terms of age, we saw that there was quite a wide age category, age gap in between the individuals engaging in finger amputation. So some societies, it was only adults, other societies, only adolescents, and then further, in some societies, it was only children or only infants that would have their fingers amputated. And in some societies, it would be individuals of multiple age classes that would have their fingers amputated. So now we're going to turn to the hands and which fingers were removed. So in some societies, it would be the left hand, usually the more non-dominant hand. However, in other societies, we also did have the right hand being used. In some societies, an individual could choose. It could be either the right hand or the left hand. There wasn't a norm or a rule about it. And in other societies, it would be both of the hands. So this means that fingers would be removed from both hands during a finger amputation episode. Also, the number of which fingers were removed also would vary amongst these groups. So the majority of them would remove the pinky, which is the most non-functional of the fingers of the hand. We can imagine that the thumb is quite necessary for functionality, same with the index finger. But as we go further down the fingers, they become a little less necessary for our usual function. However, there was also societies in which multiple fingers would have segments that would be removed from them. And in some societies, it would be segments from all of the fingers would be removed at once. And so this kind of leads on to the next point here, which was what amount of fingers would be removed? Would it be entire fingers? Would it just be a segment of a finger? And so in quite a few societies, it would just be one finger segment. So down to, the first joint of your finger. However, in a similar number of societies, it would be an entire finger that would be removed. So we would classify this as like 3 segments would be removed. In some societies, it would be perhaps multiple joints that are multiple segments from different fingers. And in some societies, it would be more than one entire finger that would be removed at the same time. And lastly here, for how this is done, we have the actual method of amputation. And predominantly, this would have been done through cutting in some form or fashion, either with a knife, an adze, an axe. In some societies, they would tie a string around the finger very tightly, and they'd keep it on there so that blood couldn't circulate to the finger, and that's how they would remove it. Other times, accounts said that fingers would be ripped off of recently deceased individuals, bitten off, or even burned off. And in some societies, they used multiple of these methods to remove the finger. So now we're going to move on to the evidence of finger amputation in the material record. So looking at ethnographic objects and archaeological sites that are at least suggestive of finger amputation practices. We have evidence from 97 archaeological sites and 9 ethnohistoric objects, which come from about 35 cultural groups or archaeological traditions. And as I mentioned previously, these are materials that are at least suggestive of finger amputation. And you may find that some of them are more convincing than others. And so we're going to go through 7 different types of these material remains that we identified. And as we can see from the map here, these are also quite widely distributed across the globe. So first we have these ethnographic objects. These are finger necklaces. These were collected in the 19th century, so between the 1800s to early 1900s, from the United States and North America. And so these fingers would have been taken from enemies that were defeated in war, and they were war trophies that would have been worn by powerful warriors. And so 6 of these finger necklaces were made from desiccated and dried or smoked fingers, as we can see in the images here. And so these would have preserved the fingers very well. We can see that there are still fingerprints and dermal ridges. And we can see some of the methods that they may have used to create these finger necklaces. We can see that the fingers would have been opened up so that they could have been manufactured into the necklace and then sewed back together. In addition to these 6 desiccated and dried finger necklaces, we also had 2 finger necklaces from skeletal phalanges, so the bones that make up the finger. And here, these would be strung by drilling a hole through the end of the phalanx, end of the bone, to string the necklace all together. And it is quite interesting that we did only find this from the United States. And this follows on with the distribution of our first archaeological remains, which are probable finger necklaces that were found in the United States and Mexico. And so these would be groups of phalanges that were found grouped together with holes drilled through them. So they would be perforated, as we can see in this image from Oxingtok. And these were found from 3 sites that have quite a wide range in dates, somewhere starting around 250 CE up till maybe 1425 CE for the date range. So what we were seeing with the ethnographic objects of finger necklaces, they may extend back quite a bit further, as we see from these possible finger necklaces from the same region. So the next type of material remains were skeletal individuals that were found missing phalanges, where the remaining phalanges had evidence of cut marks or healed amputations. So these types of individuals were found at 16 sites, and there was 22 individuals with this type of evidence of amputation. And we have a few examples over at the side here. So the first is from Merzat Koba in Crimea, so down here. And there was a woman that died when she was an adult, and she was missing both of her pinkies, the last two joints of her pinkies. And the osteological evidence suggested that these had been cut off when she was an adolescent and then had time to heal before she passed away as an adult for other causes. And the researchers that have been investigating this site have suggested that this could be evidence of an initiation rite that she went through when she was an adolescent. And we also have an example down here from a cemetery in England. This is a Roman era cemetery. And on the left here, we have an image of a normal phalanx, what it would look like without evidence of amputation and healing. And then on the right, we have an amputated phalanx. So down here at the bottom, we can see this evidence for amputation. It's a bit shorter, and then we see the evidence of healing on the bone. And this was one of a number of individuals that were found in Roman era cemeteries in England that had amputated fingers. And in addition to having amputated fingers, they were also decapitated. So it appears as though individuals were potentially being chosen for decapitation based on some kind of physical anomaly, such as having an amputated finger or something of that sort. And the date distribution for these individuals is quite large. So the individual, the woman from Merzat Koba, has been dated to somewhere between 7,000 to 10,000 BP. And then the latest individuals died somewhere around the 1400s up in Scotland. From here, we had isolated phalanges that appeared to be deliberately deposited in some kind of contextually significant location. So we had these from 25 sites, and this totals 123 phalanges found at these sites. So our first example is here from Tel Arpachia in Iraq, so over here. And this is from the 4th century BCE. And in this photo here, we have the remains from a shrine. And in this shrine, there was what is described as a mother goddess figurine, a male figurine, and then also there was 5 finger bones that were carved from stone. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then there was also a real human finger bone that was included with these 5 fingers that have been carved from stone in the shrine deposit. And another example here is from Fiji, out here in the South Pacific, where we had an infant that was buried. And then beside the infant, we had 6 adult distal phalanges. So the final segment of the finger joint of 6 adults were buried with the child. And this connects to the ethnohistoric practice of Fijians of a finger amputation as a mourning custom. And so they would cut off their finger in extreme grief and then place it with the individual that had died. And so we're actually able to see this practice continuation into the archaeological record. And so the time span for these incomplete or isolated phalanges is even larger than the previous example of the individuals with missing phalanges. So the earliest example is from the site of Oblazowa Cave in Poland from the Gravettian, so 27,000 to 22,000 BP, where in a cave, a single phalanx was found surrounded by other ritual objects like a Arctic fox tooth pendant and a boomerang. Up until the 1500 CE with a site in Mexico. So our next type of material remain here is is finger bowls. So these are quite similar to the isolated phalanges. However, they're associated just with the Maya from classic America, from Central America, the classic Maya from Central America. There we go. And so this was found at 25 sites. And what these remains are their finger bones or phalanges that are found in bowls. And we have an example from Actocan in Belize here. And so sometimes it would be a single bowl with a single phalange in it, but we did have evidence of some sites that were much greater in their number, where there would be 200 finger bowls with 206 phalanges in a single deposit. And these deposits range from the late pre-classic period in the Maya history, so 400 BCE to 250 CE, up until the terminal classic or late classic era, which went to 800 CE. So now we're getting into what is much more some of the circumstantial evidence for finger amputation. It's less so the direct physical indications that somebody has had a finger amputated, such as the skeletal individuals with missing phalanges. And this is where a lot of the debate around finger amputation in the archaeological record has come from. So these are hand images with incomplete fingers. They've been found at 35 sites, and there's 291 of these images. So these would be images of hands, either hand prints or hand stencils, as we can see in this image from Indonesia here, that appeared to be missing finger segments. And so there has been a long-standing debate about these images for over 100 years in the published literature, as to whether these represent hands from which fingers have been amputated, or whether people are just folding their fingers over to create these hand images. And the debate has really, up until this point, centered around 12 sites from Upper Paleolithic Europe, from France and Spain, that date to the Gravettian, so between 27 to 22,000 years ago. And in this research, we've identified additional sites outside of Europe that bring us to this number of 35. And these have quite a large range in date. The earliest is from Indonesia, which has been directly dated. We can see where the dating was directly from on the image. And it's been dated to somewhere between 26,000 to 27.4 thousand years ago. And of course, this is just a coincidence, but I do find it quite interesting that the date range for Indonesia and Upper Paleolithic Europe are around the same time period. And we can see that there is quite a bit of variation in what fingers seem to be incomplete. In some cases, it is just a pinky finger, just one finger, whereas in other cases, such as in Upper Paleolithic Europe, we have a number of different fingers that are either fully missing or partially missing. And this leads us on to our final type of material remains, which are incomplete impressions. So these have been found at 2 sites from the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. And these would be impressions that somebody had left with their hand in hardened mud, and then the mud, or in wet mud at the time, and then the mud hardened around their hand. And we were able to find an actual molding of this incomplete impression. So the images over here is from Grotte Gargas in France. And Grotte Gargas also has incomplete hand images. It has 93, the most numerous in Upper Paleolithic Europe, actually the most numerous of all of the sites of incomplete hand images that we've identified across the globe. And so this incomplete impression is thought to have been made by an adolescent around 13 to 14 years old, and it is of a left hand that is missing part of their pinky finger, suggesting that at least one person was at the site in the same time period as the incomplete hand impressions are being made that was missing a finger. And we also have evidence that there was these impressions from Lascaux. These are both in Ali Salih's doctoral thesis from the 1960s. And unfortunately, a mold wasn't made of the incomplete impression from Lascaux. But interestingly, it is quite similar in that it is just a pinky finger that is missing from that individual as well. So let's go over a little summary of the behaviors that we've seen here. So we identified finger amputation practices in 181 ethnohistoric cultures and from 97 different archaeological sites. And we can see the distribution of them over in this map here. And we found that generally the material evidence of potential finger amputation was often found in areas where there was well-known ethnohistoric finger amputation customs. So it seemed as though archaeologists that were digging in these regions had this notion of cultural finger amputation on their radar. And so in cases where perhaps a finger might be missing, a finger bone, it's very small, it's easy to get lost, it's easy to degrade, they might have been thinking a little bit more, well, this might have to do with that finger amputation custom that we know about, so let's investigate this a little bit more. However, in other regions where this connection isn't as well known, it may be that archaeologists are saying, okay, well, we're missing some finger bones. They're small, it happens. It's just taphonomy, it's just preservation. And then we don't really find that evidence for finger amputation because it's not really on the radar for a certain region. So because of this, we think that we may be missing more examples in the archaeological record for finger amputation. So now we're going to move on to beliefs, and we'll start with folk tales that feature finger amputation. So we identified 91 different folk tales from 71 different culture groups that had finger amputation in the tales. And we can again see that this is quite widely distributed. There are tales that we identified from cultures of all inhabited continents, though of course some continents are better represented than others. And we identified 18 different folktale themes. 5 of them were major themes. So these were themes that were found in 10 or more tales. And we'll go through examples of each one of these going forward. And then we also identified 13 different minor themes. And these were themes that were found in less than 10 tales. And we're just going to go through a couple of examples of these just in the purpose of time. But if you're interested in any of them, I'd love to talk about them afterwards. So let's go through these major themes. And the first one, the most common theme, was finger amputation as a transformative act. This was found in 20 tales from 19 societies. And an example of this can be found in a tale of the Tucano people from the Amazon down in South America. And it's the tale of the Yage woman. And in this tale, a woman is pregnant, and as she's giving birth, the midwife, she's grabbing on so tightly to help her through this really difficult pregnancy, and she accidentally twists off her finger. And this happens twice, that she twists off 2 fingers. And the Yage woman tells her, plant my fingers into the ground and they will grow into something. And the woman's like, okay, seems kind of strange, but I'll plant your fingers for you. So she digs a hole and she plants the fingers, and the fingers both grow into the cocoa and the Yage plants, which are very important plants for the Tucano people. And so we can see that an amputated finger then transformed into something else. So that would be the theme of a transformative act. Our second major theme was as a punishment. This was found in 15 tales from 14 societies. And our example is a German tale. And so the tale is Little Suck-a-Thumb. And a young boy is warned, if you don't suck your thumb, because if you do, something bad is going to happen. But he just can't resist. He sucks his thumb anyways. And then we have a scissor wielding man that comes in and cuts off his thumb because he didn't listen to his mother. And so this is quite a juvenile or fun version of this tale. But of course, the theme of punishment can be more severe than this more light folk tale. Our third major theme was finger amputation involved in the eating or consumption of humans. This was found in 15 tales from 15 societies. And our example is a Byzantine tale. This is the dog-headed men. And so in this tale, these dog-headed men capture a group of humans and they're going to cook them. So they have a big cauldron, they put all the humans inside of them and they start boiling them. And then to test to see whether they're done, they cut off one of their little pinkies so they can taste to see if they're ready to be eaten. And this is quite a common way that finger amputation features in these tales about eating humans. And kind of along a similar vein, our next major theme is to escape monsters. This was found in 11 tales from 9 societies. And our example is from a Scottish tale. And it's the tale of the 9 children at Sunart. And so there are 9 children that are playing by a lake. And they see this horse type being. Sometimes it's more of a water dwelling creature. Sometimes it's a horse. It changes in the different variations of the tale. But they think that it's so beautiful, this creature, whatever it is, that they all start to get on top of it because they want to ride it. But then they realize that they're stuck and it's going to take them away. And one of the children had just started to get onto the creature. They just touched it with one of their fingers. And so when they realized that they were stuck, they cut off their finger so that the monster wouldn't get them and they would be free. And they were the only one to survive in this tale, as the other children were taken away by the monster into the lake. And our final major theme here is creation. So this was found in the creation tales of 10 societies. And I think this one is very fascinating. So we have an example over at the side here from the Maori from New Zealand in Polynesia. And in their creation story, Mahuika, the fire goddess, is the one who grants fire to Maui, one of the Maori people in the creation tale. And so to grant him the gift of fire, she pulls off one of her fingers because each one of them has fire coming out of the end of it. And she rips off one of her fingers to grant fire to Maui and to the Maori people. And this is a similar, obviously not about fire each time, but it's a similar type of presentation that we see in these tales. For example, amongst the Baiga, the Nanga Baiga, who is the first man, amputates his finger and cuts it into 4 pieces and plants it in 4 places on the globe to grant fertile land to the globe so that they're able to plant food and eat for generations. So this is a similar type of theme of finger amputation in these creation tales. So now we'll just go over a couple examples of the minor themes. So these would be found, in a couple of tales. The first is a theme of sacrifice. This is found in 4 different tales. This is where a finger would be amputated and then offered to a deity or supernatural power, such as when it is offered to the Tongan shark god of Tawhatahi in a Tongan tale. Next, we have the minor theme of a remedy. So this was found just in 2 Irish tales. And in one tale, an amputated finger was used to treat a toothache. So they said to amputate a finger and then to rub it on your gums, and this would cure your toothache. And then finally, we have the minor theme of grief, which was also only found in 1 tale, a Fijian tale. And again, this probably connects back to this ethno-historic practice of finger amputation as a mourning custom that we saw also in the archaeological record, we're seeing that it features in Fijian folk tales as well, such as the tale of the Vasukilagi, in which a brother and a sister go to a spiritual realm, and there the sister believes that the brother has died because he enters into this magical sleep. And so in mourning and in grief, she cuts off one of her fingers and puts it on his chest. And then the blood that drips from her fingers ends up being a path that he can follow after he wakes up from his magical sleep to find her again. So as I said, it was just a couple of examples just in the need for a time frame here. But if you did want to talk more about some of those other themes in the folk tales, I'd be happy to discuss a little bit more. But now I want to move on to motivations for finger amputation. So what we did here is we went back to the records of the 181 ethnohistoric cultures, and we looked into the records to see why were people engaging in these practices. And so we identified 18 different motivations for finger amputation. And we can see that we created a typology just for explanatory sake to make it a little bit easier, because they can be grouped into different types. So the first split that we have is between finger amputation that is surgical and cultural. Predominantly, we've been focusing on the cultural examples of finger amputation, but in our records, we do often find evidence for finger amputation as a surgery. So the finger has got frostbite, it's got gangrene, it's been crushed, and now we have to amputate it. And so we might as well add it to our typology here. So we first have the split between surgical and cultural. For the cultural finger amputation practices, these can be split into whether the participant is alive at the time of amputation or they're recently deceased. And the notion of recently deceased is important here. It's not that individuals are going into a tomb or a grave and taking the finger bones, but it's very quickly after somebody has passed away that their fingers would have been amputated. And in the alive category, they're split between practices that are normative and forced. Normative here means that it's relatively voluntary. It is an agreed upon custom in a society. It's known that at age 12, all children get their left pinky amputated. Of course, this becomes a little bit of a gray area as to what's voluntary, what's involuntary. So that's why we generally call it normative. It's a normative custom that's agreed upon and everyone knows that it happens in this way. And then we also have the forced customs. So these would be instances where the person is having to be held down. It's a punishment. It's something that is forced upon the individual. It's absolutely involuntary. For the deceased, we have the distinction is whether the individual that's having their finger amputated is a part of your own community. Is it a beloved family member? Is it your chief? Is it somebody that you know and love? Or is it a member of an outgroup, somebody that's outside of your community that you don't have a direct emotional or kinship tie to in any way? And so now we're going to go through the different motivations for finger amputation, as I think that's some of the most interesting parts of it, to really get into the nitty-gritties of why are people doing this. So of course, as I mentioned, we have the starting off with the surgical explanation. In our survey, we only found that there was 9 societies that engaged in surgical finger amputation. However, it's very likely that most, if not all, societies would amputate a finger that was obviously damaged and causing harm. But it may just be that it's not something that's recorded all that often. Or perhaps our keywords were more focused on cultural amputation, and in the future we could do to add more surgical related terms to be searching with in our surveys. So our next motivation, and this is, we'll start with the normative and alive motivations. So these would be individuals that are doing it to themselves, or perhaps to their children, but it is a normative practice. So in 5 societies, there were accounts that men would cut off fingers to avoid being drafted into the military. And so one example comes from Rome, where it was such an ongoing practice in the Roman army that multiple different laws had to be passed as to what to do with men that were cutting off their fingers. And primarily, it would be men cutting off their thumbs so that they couldn't hold the big broadsword that would be needed in war. So at first, they were able to avoid the draft, but then laws were passed that stated you have to go to war anyways, even without your thumb. And then finally, it got so bad that men were burned for trying to evade the draft by cutting off their thumbs. And this is something that not only happened in Rome, but generally seems to be a European-focused practice, but this may just be where we're seeing more evidence for this wide-scale military practice at the time. Our next motivation is in a bet. So here, fingers would be amputated to pay for a lost bet. So perhaps you bet a bunch of money and you don't have it. You lost the money in a previous bet, or you never had it to begin with. And so to pay for the lost bet, you would have to amputate a portion of your finger, such as amongst the Huron-Wendat, which are an Iroquoian group in Canada here, who, if they lost a bet, would have to amputate a portion of their finger and not show any pain. And that's how they would be able to repay the debt that they were owed from a lost bet. So next we have grief. And this is the most common motivation that we found in the entire sample. This was found in 42 societies and has quite a wide geographic scope. Though, of course, there is Eurasia, which is primarily an area where this doesn't seem to have been practiced. So here, a finger segment would be removed when a family member dies. And we see again this example of a Dani individual from Indonesia. And so we can see that if you have to remove a finger segment every time a family member dies, that over the years, you will have to engage in this practice quite a few times as more and more of your kin and family pass away. Next, we have the motivation of love. And this was only found in one society. This was Japan in the Edo era. And this was to express devotion to a lover. So we have this amazing drawing from a historical account from the 1600s, where an individual wanted to express the devotion that they had for an actor. And so they jumped up onto the stage and cut off one of their fingers to demonstrate their devotion to the individual up on stage. And, you know, everyone was clapping, and it was this big deal to demonstrate how much they loved them. Our next motivation is identity. So this would be cutting off a portion of a finger to mark group membership. And this was found in 16 societies. And one of these societies from Southern Africa, the Xhosa, this is something that is still done. If you do some digging online, you can see different Xhosa individuals from both sides of the argument saying, it's our tradition, we absolutely want to continue this, and others saying, I will never have a portion of my child amputated. And we can see images of Xhosa people who have had the final segment of the pinky on their left hand amputated to mark them as a Xhosa individual. Next, we have the motivation of marriage. So this would be to signal marital status. This is found in 4 societies across the globe. And we have this image of a Khoikhoi women who are dancing, and the Khoikhoi are down here in Southern Africa. And this was a larger page, this image from the 1700s. And a comment in Dutch under this middle woman states that she was obviously a widow. And the illustrator knew this because she was missing 2 finger segments. Because every time a Khoikhoi woman gets married, she has to cut off a portion of her finger to show that she's married. But then if her husband dies, she has to remove another finger segment to release the spirit of her dead husband so that she could then be allowed to remarry, in which she would have to cut off a 3rd finger segment to be allowed to be remarried. So next we have the motivation of remedy. So this would be to heal an illness, but this is different than surgical in that it's not a direct reaction to a damaged finger. This is that you're removing an undamaged finger to try to heal some kind of sickness, either in yourself or in somebody else. And this was practiced in 19 societies across the globe. And our example here is from Joseon era Korea. And here in Korea, there is a large importance on Confucian thought of filial piety. So your piety to your family members, particularly your parents. And so there was these books that were put out on filial piety and virtues of filial piety from the 1400s to the 1600s. And one of these accounts, which represents a larger phenomenon, apparently there are 200 accounts of this, of what is called filial cannibalism, where here we have the young Kim Saul, who has amputated one of her fingers and has put it in a bowl for her sick mother to consume to help to heal her mother. And so her act of filial piety is amputating a portion of herself to try to heal her mother. Next, we have the motivation of penance. This is to apologize for a transgression. This is found in one society. So this is from Japan, the Yakuza members. And amongst Yakuza members who are like a organized crime syndicate in Japan, there are 2 types of finger amputation. One that is for a punishment. You do something wrong and the boss tells you have to cut off a finger. But also there are many accounts of men who are doing it voluntarily. They know that they've done something wrong, and perhaps the punishment might be greater than cutting off a finger. And so they try to ease the wrongdoing by cutting off a finger voluntarily in penance. Next, we have the motivation of sacrifice. So this would be cutting off a finger to request aid from some kind of supernatural power or a deity. And this is found in 33 societies. An example can be found of a Tongan individual from the South Pacific. And in Tonga, it was quite often that it would be done that fingers would be amputated to appeal to a deity. For example, the very first king of Tonga, George Tupou I, had one of his fingers amputated when his father died, and he amputated it to the supernatural power to request that all of his father's sins be washed away so that he may have a peaceful afterlife. So now we move on to the forced motivations. The first we have is to oppress or to mark domination over an oppressed group. We have a Ham man, and he is a culture in Southern Africa. And the neighboring Damaro, who would capture Ham men and other nomadic cultures from that region and force them into slavery. And they would mark them as slaves by cutting off one of their pinky fingers. So now we have punishment. So this would be to punish a transgression. This is found in 35 societies. And as I mentioned quite early on in the presentation, one of our more recent records in this survey was a punishment for theft, in which finger amputation would be performed in Iran. And the record that we found was from 2003. However, finger amputation as a punishment for theft in Iran is still an ongoing practice. This is an image from one of these public finger amputation incidents from 2022. So still something that is going on today. And this is often for theft. Can't remember if I just said that or not. So next, for our forced motivations, we have torture. So this would be just to directly inflict pain on an individual, often to get some kind of information out of them. This was found in 6 societies. And we have an example here in the Iroquois culture from Canada. It was a common method of torture. And a very well-known account is of a Jesuit priest who had 2 of his fingers amputated. Not sure if you can quite see them in the image there, in an attempt to have him renounce his faith. So now we're going to move on to motivations where the individual is deceased at the time of amputation, and we'll start in instances where it was a deceased community member. So in 5 societies, an amputated finger would be made into some kind of magical object or worshiping device. So here amongst the Sakalava from Madagascar, they would amputate fingers from very beloved chiefs and kings. And today, some of these amputated fingers are actually kept in a reliquary in a village, a Sakalava village, in which pilgrimages are done to the area so that they may come and visit and be healed and gain wisdom from these relics, of which fingers are said to be a part of them. So next we have the motivation of indicating death. This was found in 2 societies. And we talked previously about one of these examples, the American veteran, that said that amputated fingers would be used to identify fallen comrades in a mass grave context. And in Roman armies, because they were so far from home, they often couldn't bring back the body of deceased soldiers. They were often cremated, but they would cut off a finger and bring it back to the family to demonstrate that their loved one had died, and so that they could have some kind of burial if they wanted to with that remaining finger. So now we're going to, so this is a similar type of motivation to one that we've already seen, which is sacrifice. So this would be to request aid from a deity. You cut off a finger to request aid, but here it's on a recently deceased individual. And this was found in 10 societies. And we have an example here from the Kwakwaka'wakw culture in Canada, very close to where I'm from, here on the West Coast. And here, if a husband and wife had a lot of their children die in infancy, what they would do is their most recent child that had died, they would cut off one of their fingers. And this would be an attempt to cut off the deaths. They'd be asking the creator, the spirits, to please cut off the deaths so that we may have our children grow up. And then what they would do is the Kwakwaka'wakw would bury children, or I guess not bury, but they would place deceased children in boxes up in trees. And so they would then put this child away from the other children so that these malevolent spirits that they thought were influencing the family wouldn't influence the rest of the society. So now we'll turn to motivations in which the individual who had their finger amputated when they were recently deceased was a member of an outgroup, so wasn't from your direct community, wasn't someone that you directly knew. So here we have the motivation of talisman, so to create a magical object again, but again, this is not from a beloved chief or king, as we saw in the Sakalava case. This is from somebody that you do not know. And this was found in 6 societies across the globe. And one example of this can be found from England, where individuals that were publicly executed, there would be accounts of people coming up and trying to cut off the fingers of these individuals so that they could take them to be magical relics to give them good luck. And here we can see a slight example of this, where an individual is trying to gather the blood of somebody that has been put to death. And our final motivation here is finger amputation as a trophy. So to mark victory over an enemy that you have vanquished in battle. This was found in 23 societies, and our example here is from the Marquesas in the South Pacific. Here, warriors would cut off fingers as well as heads from people that they had killed in battle. We can see this Marquesan warrior has a trophy head, but the fingers would be attached to these fans or to their loincloths, and this would demonstrate their valor as a great warrior. So now I just want to give a brief overview of these beliefs. So we had 18 different folktale themes that feature finger amputation, and also 18 different motivations for finger amputation in the ethnohistoric record. And 4 of these themes and motivations had crossovers. And interestingly, 3 of them, punishment, sacrifice, and grief, were actually found in the same cultures. So a culture would practice finger amputation as a punishment, and also they would have folk tales that featured finger amputation as a punishment. Same thing for sacrifice and for grief. However, this same crossover was not found in the remedy motivation, as it was a tale from Ireland that featured finger amputation as a remedy, and we did not find any records that the Irish actually did engage in this practice. So to give a bit of a general summary here, so we had at least one type of evidence present from 228 different culture groups and 97 archaeological sites. So this would be 181 ethnohistoric societies that had evidence of finger amputation practices. There was also an additional 47 societies that had folk tales that featured finger amputation, but we didn't find any records that they actually practiced finger amputation. And then the 97 archaeological sites. And from this, again, we could see that it wasn't constrained to a specific type of society. It had a very large geographic scope. It's present on all inhabited continents. And it seems to range in date quite widely. If we take the more direct evidence of finger amputation in the archaeological record from the woman in the site of Murzak Koba in Crimea, then we can suggest that finger amputation may have been practiced by humans for at least 7,000 to 10,000 years. But if we take the more circumstantial evidence of finger amputation from the incomplete hand images, this suggests that finger amputation might have been going back to 26 to 27,000 years, and that it's still an ongoing practice today. We saw Soso individuals who today have parts of their fingers amputated as a group marker, and that in Iran, finger amputation is still used as a punishment. And finger amputation as a cultural custom was carried out for many different reasons. There was a lot of variability to this practice. And I think that's one of the main benefits of doing such a broad scale scope study of a practice that we might be interested in, such as finger amputation. If we only focused on ethnography or archaeology or folk tales, we wouldn't really get this full summary picture that this has been something that we as humans have been doing surprisingly often for thousands of years. And until we bring all of this together and use data from many different fields, we would have no way of really knowing that. So, of course, there's always more to be done. And so our next few steps, we want to expand our surveys of historical documents and folk tales in particular. The folk tales we only really got from 3 different sources. There are so many more places that we could look for them. And historical documents, if we dive more deeply into law codes, we'll be able to find perhaps that finger amputation was used more often as a punishment or other different types of practices. Also, I mentioned previously that the material evidence for finger amputation is often found in areas where researchers might know that finger amputation was a custom. So we'd also like to do a survey of the archaeological record and published materials to see if there are other instances where cultural finger amputation wasn't considered, but may be an explanation for either, missing phalanges, isolated phalanges, or other types of evidence. Also, we want to review sources in more languages, and specifically including additional surveys by fluent individuals. We found sources in 8 different languages, but I personally can only read English and French. And so the other sources are being read through automatic translation systems like ChatGPT or Google Lens. And so because we're not fluent in these languages, there's undoubtedly just this level of depth that we're not able to fully get at. And lastly, we want to assess how many unique finger amputation practices there are. I outlined these finger amputation practices just based on motivation, but there's differences in each of these motivation types for who the participants are, how the practice was carried out, and how many finger segments were removed. So we're interested in seeing just how variable the practice of finger amputation is when you take all of those variables into account. And that's all. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for the invitation. If you've got any questions, I'd love to answer them. And in the future, if you want to talk more at all, please feel free to reach out over my email, Twitter, or my website. Thank you very much.